In this discussion, I'd like to talk about what happens when the angle of the wind is off. In this case, I set up a moderately strong wind with the wind direction at 290 degrees. First off, I'd like to say that we strongly advise that beginners fly in conditions where the wind is within 30 degrees of perpendicular for the section in which you're flying, and 15 to 25 knots at ridge top. That said, when the parameters they're outside of those bounds, that's not to say that the ridge is not going to work. It's not like just the lift just shuts off. What happens instead is things get much more complicated. There's many more factors that will affect how the lift works, how high it sets up, and certain sections might not work, which is to say that I like to say that the lift band becomes less robust. That said, I think that for general awareness and knowledge, it's worth investigating and understanding how a ridge band works when the angle starts to get outside of 30 degrees, in this case about 45 degrees. So if the conditions shift over the course of the day, or perhaps when you build more experience and you start exploring a wider range of conditions, that you are prepared to deal with them. So a couple things happen. When the angle gets off, oftentimes the ridge band lower works not as well and becomes much, much, much more turbulent, much more violent. And the reason for that is the wind is coming in at a kind of a cross angle, and the wind interacts quite a bit more with the trees, and it just basically, when you get within a couple hundred feet, you'll get into this really violent wash above the ridge, and that wash usually doesn't work so well. Usually when you get down there, if you end up in it, you work on getting out of it. And it's, because once you get a little bit higher, once you get to 18, 1900, 2000 feet, the ridge band often gets stronger. Conversely, though, particularly on days when it's overcast, if the thermals are not working so well, sometimes when it gets pretty westerly, in this case, I mean, it could be northerly as well, I mean, but oftentimes we talk about off-angle days when they're westerly because we just get many more of them. Sometimes when it's overcast, when the thermals aren't working so well, the upper part of the band falls down a little bit, and you're not able to get quite as high off the ridge, or if the wind is not all that strong. And the trap here, the difficulty, is you end up in a position where you can't get any lower because the ridge band is not working. It's violent. It's all turbulence, all messed up and torn apart. And you cannot get any higher because you're not able to float there. And if you start finding that kind of condition, if you start settling down, you're going to fall right off pretty quickly. That said, if the wind is blowing pretty well, if you have good thermal activity, oftentimes you can float, in that upper band. And what ends up happening is the more westerly it is, or the more off angle it is, the higher you have to be off the ridge in order for it to work. So if the wind is 30 degrees off, maybe it's only about 150 feet or so when it gets solid. If it's 45 degrees off, then it's about maybe 400 or 500 feet. And we generally don't fly in conditions where it's even more off than that, but it's still, the effect is still there. So you might still find good air 1,000 feet above the ridge if you're kind of thermaling along, if the wind is even more off angle, but if you get any lower, it doesn't work at all. So and the net effect is this is how we would fly an off angle ridge. Now, again, I am emphasizing that a rank beginner just shouldn't fly in a day like today. They should just pick a better day and avoid conditions where the wind is off angle. But I am doing this to point out basically what happens and how it works, and so something to prepare for in the future. Another thing that's worth noting, and I'm going to turn on the thermal helper for this discussion, is, in this case, as we're heading into the wind, the thermals have become a very important part of the ridge, of the overall band. If the thermals are not there, it becomes really hard to fly in an off-angle wind. If the thermals are there, they add quite a bit of energy. But the problem is, as you're approaching the thermal, you're approaching it in a, with the wind at a 45-degree angle, and you have to traverse a really wide band of sink. Now, when you hit the lift, you'll have also, if you're going into the wind, you're going to spend quite a bit of time in the lift. But if you're heading into the thermal on the upwind side, you're going to be spending a lot of time in the sink before you get there. And that becomes particularly consequential when you have cloud streets. So if you have really powerful streets and a really wide band of sink, you might get squashed down onto the ridge top easily before you even get to the lift, and that's a really, really bad place to be. So definitely watch out for the sink, and that's another reason you want to stay high. Finally, I want to show one of the traps, or one of the things to be really careful about. So I'm going to go and pull this spoilers. You would not want to be this low on a day where the wind is off angle, because while Congress doesn't simulate this, the lift wouldn't really be working all that well, and it would become really violent. But the point I wanted to show is what happens when you turn, when you're going into the wind and then you turn around. So if I slow down to 45 knots, first of all, the ridge band is not working all that well, but the more important thing is your ground speed is very slow, and that's kind of obvious when you're going into the wind. But then if I turn around, this is a really kind of tricky trap here, that when you're going up, in this case uphill, and with the tailwind and the ridge is not working great, notice how fast that ground speed is. Notice how fast those trees are coming past us, because we have that strong tailwind component pushing us along. But notice the fact that we're not climbing all that well. And so this creates a pretty sinister visual illusion where you think that your airspeed is a lot higher than it really is. And in this case, I am just barely sustaining along at 45 knots, and yet, I may feel like I'm going faster, so I think I can afford to go slower, but yet you can't. So if you have a strong tailwind component, like in such a situation, you want to be very mindful of watching your airspeed, because it's very easy to want to pull back. Among other thoughts about off-angle ridges is that, kind of thinking again to this idea of the formula, and when things get outside the formula, the conditions become less robust, they become less predictable. Well, as a general rule of thumb, ridges that have a lot of issues, so like things like where they have a lot of gaps and spurs and bowls, those ridges tend to be less tolerant of the direction being off. In fact, there are certain ridges that they'll really won't work once the wind is much more than 30 degrees off. But if you have a section of ridge that has few upwind obstructions and is a pretty nice straight line, even if the angle is pretty far off, the wind will still be kind of forced up and over eventually. It doesn't go straight parallel. I mean, it just, at least at or above ridgetop, it will still angle over the top of the ridge. However, if there's any issues at all, if there's any gap, any bowl, any spur, anything that makes it easier for the direction to peel off and go parallel, if that's the path of least resistance, it will take any opportunity to do that. So, to sum up, this demonstration is not to suggest flying in an off-angle ridge. I mean, look at the weather forecasts and track the weather as the day goes on, such that you're well prepared for any possible shifts that occur. And if it does occur, then your best bet is just to thermal up and get off the ridge, and stay in the higher part of the band. However, if you find yourself in a day where the wind does shift on you, or if you start exploring days like this in order to kind of build your margins and such, the things to pay attention to are that the more off angle it is, the higher you have to be off the ridge for the ridge band to work. And And should you end up getting lower, that expect that the ridge band is not really going to work well. It's going to be pretty turbulent and violent. And especially if you have a tailwind, component, then pay a lot of attention to your airspeed, because it's very easy to slow down and and get too slow.